Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeanette Sanipatin. I am the California State Director for Drug Policy Alliance. Good afternoon also for the folks on the East Coast. I come to you today from Gabrielino and Tongaland, also known as Los Angeles. I want to welcome you to our fireside chat today on the history of Black migration to the Americas. We want to uplift this conversation today to take a deeper dive into the complexities and layers of the Latinx community here in the United States. We know that this conversation will be challenging, but critical to ensure that we develop leadership within the criminal justice reform movement. But it is also so important for us to understand the root causes and develop solidarity moving forward. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for this panel, Jennifer Blemur. Jennifer serves as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Coalition to Transform Advanced Care, an organization dedicated to supporting those experiencing serious illness and their caregivers. In addition to her professional work, Jennifer is incredibly involved in her community. She served as the president of the DC Young Democrats since 2020 and is the chair of the Legislative Affairs Committee for the Washington Bar Association for the Young Lawyers Decision. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Jeanette. Good morning, everyone. Super happy to be here and be a part of this conversation. As Jeanette said, I'm Jennifer Blemur, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today. Before I introduce our panelists, I just, again, want to provide the opportunity to level set. You may hear some things today that you agree with, and you may hear some things that you don't agree with. But you'll also hear points today that will invite you to challenge your thoughts and create spaces for you to grow. So don't feel called out, but rather feel called into the conversation. It's important that we start having it and having it often. We wanted to introduce our panelists for today, Janvieve Williams Comrie, who is Executive Director of Afroresistance, Luis Suave Gonzalez of the Suave podcast, and Kassandra Frederique, Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. I wasn't sure if they were going to come on screen or not. Okay. Now I wanted to just hand this over to Janvieve Williams Comrie to give us an overview of Black migration. Janvieve, you're on mute.
All right. I will start again. Buenas tardes a todas, todos y todes. Hoy hablaré en inglés, ya que pienso que la mayoría de los y las participantes hablan inglés. Mil disculpas a mis hermanos en la lucha. My name is Janvieve Williams Comrie. I'm the current Executive Director of Afroresistance. Thank you to the organizers of this event. Part of the centering of our time together is to acknowledge the European colonization of the Americas that took place in 1492. And this was the beginning process of which European settlers populated the regions of North, Central, South America, and the islands of the Caribbean. It is also recognized as a direct cause for the various indigenous peoples and cultures of the Americas being replaced, mass eradicated, and displaced. While the southern states, next slide, please. While the southern states is associated with slavery, capturing and forceful relocation of Africans, it is estimated that almost 4.5 million enslaved Africans were enslaved in the Caribbean, and another 3.2 million in what is known to be present-day Brazil, as well as other countries such as Guyana, Argentina, and Colombia. So as you can see by the map, right, that you see on the screen, throughout the Americas, we have a very large percentage, right? So we see that Brazil had over 3 million enslaved people. Then we have the Guyanas as well. And you see the Caribbean islands and the Caribbean coast, which includes Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, has over 2 million enslaved people. So what we see today then is over 150 million African descendant people in the American region. That is why it's important for us to have an African-wide consciousness, because Black people, we are part of the Americas, and we have the largest concentration of Africans outside of Africa that is in the Americas. And it makes sense that we also migrate not only to the United States, but we also migrate throughout the Americas. So when we talk about migration, just picture that we migrate not only looking towards the United States, but we migrate inter-Americas, right? So we don't only migrate from the rest of the Americas to the United States, but we also migrate from Haiti to Brazil, to Panama, to Jamaica, from Guyana to Costa Rica. So we also migrate inter-Americas, but we also, it's a reality that we also migrate towards the United States. Black people are most numerous in Brazil. There's more than 10 million people that are Black in Brazil. Haiti, obviously, it's a Black nation, over 10 million people. Then you have countries like Colombia, Panama, Dominican Republic, which over 8.5 million people. Venezuela alone has over 4 million people that are Black. Ecuador has over 1.1 million people. What are some of the current issues in these countries? Why do people migrate, right? In countries like Haiti, there's a current humanitarian crisis in a country where nearly half the population is facing high acute food insecurity and coronavirus infections are surging. This is very current. There's also a historical issue that I'm not going to get into because we don't have enough time, but you should do the research if you don't know it already. In Honduras, right, Garifuna women land defenders are often incriminated for the offenses of land usurpation. The charges against them are related to the historic process of resistance by the Garifuna people to the plunder of their lands. Private businesses and governments alike have participated in the illegal appropriation of ancestral territory of the Garifuna people. Many Garifuna women heads of households end up as political prisoners. So when we talk about indigenous rights, these are Black indigenous people, recognized and acknowledged as indigenous people. Police brutality, when we talk about criminalization, has always been used throughout the region against Black people in Latin America and the Caribbean, and is usually the result of pervasive impunity, lack of oversight, and an institutional culture that permits and at times encourages abuse. And this is usually sponsored by tax dollars coming from the United States. Racist police violence is often an extension or manifestation of structural racism, white supremacy, and economic injustice throughout the region. When we add to that healthcare access in Latin America, it's not accessible to everybody, even though in most countries in Latin America, it is universal. Preventable diseases such as heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, as well as 40% of all cancers, including breast cancers, are disproportionately impacting the Black community. Currently, Afroresistance has an open regional survey that we launched last year around access to vaccines, for example. And the preliminary results shows that 73.3% of Black women believe that since the pandemic started, there has not been an actual consultation of the Black community in general on behalf of their states in regards to how states have been in working with the Black community to see the servicing of, and not only the servicing, but the trust that Black communities have in the healthcare system of their countries, because it has never been about how does the public system support Black communities? Why? Because public policy does not work for Black communities. It has never been about that because the leadership has never been Black. Add to that in the region, Africans from the continent that also migrate to the region are migrating in larger numbers. So in the region itself, Africans from the continent are stuck and left undocumented and in very precarious situations. And we know that when women migrate, women are stuck because there's a gender issue that doesn't really take into account women and children. Next slide, please. This is why Afroresistance actually exists. It's a Black, Latino, Latinx, Latina-led organization with the mission to educate. Oh, next slide, sorry. Next slide. And the principles are language justice. We work, and this directly relates to migration, right? It's not only Spanish and English, it's not just Black and white, right? So I spoke about the Garifunas earlier on. The Garifunas have their own specific language that is not Spanish. Haiti doesn't operate in Spanish, right? So when we talk about Blackness, we have to also talk about different languages. Brazil, the largest country in the region, does not operate in Spanish. So language justice and Blackness operates in multiple languages. So we have to take that into account. When we talk about language justice, we also talk about Black unity. It goes hand in hand. Gender justice, when we talk about Blackness, we have to talk about Black women always falling through the cracks of organizing. Racial justice has to center Blackness. We can't talk about migration that doesn't, oh, I think I froze. We can't talk about racial justice that doesn't center Blackness when we talk about migration. And we can't talk about migration that doesn't center reproductive justice because as a Black woman and an immigrant woman from Latin America, we always fall through the cracks. And when we talk about criminal justice, that migration has to honor our movement regardless of our status. Now, when we talk specifically about this, right? And it's so complicated sometimes for us to understand the complexities. And I'll just give you some quick examples just to open up, I guess, the conversation later on and just to give you some points to ponder. Throughout Latin America, Black women, including Black LGBTQ leaders, are constantly targeted, kidnapped, incarcerated, threatened, and murdered. This is evident in countries such as Brazil and Colombia that we see in the media, but also in countries such as Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, and Ecuador. About 64% of women incarcerated in Brazil are Black, with 48% identified as mixed race and 50% as Afro descent. In prisons in Argentina,
All right. Okay. So, of course, it would not be COVID and Zoom world if we didn't have technical issues. So hopefully we'll be able to get Janvieve back on so she can finish her comments. While we're doing that, I do want to take time, if we are able to, again, just introduce our panelists. Again, that's Kassandra Frederique, who's the Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance, and then Luis Suave Gonzalez of the Suave podcast. Hopefully, again, like I said, we'll be able to get Janvieve back on. But in case we aren't, we just had the opportunity to hear a bit about Black migration to the Americas. And probably for many of this has been the first time we've heard such a comprehensive analysis of this migration and the implication it has had on the Americas and its peoples, especially for individuals and communities of African descent. As hopefully we'll be able to get Janvieve back on, but I wanted to turn to our fireside chat with our panelists and want to welcome them and perfect, great. Welcome and thank you for being a part of this important conversation. While we wait for Janvieve to come back on, I want to start this over. Okay, perfect. So Janvieve, it's remote world. Sometimes your computer's going to do what it does. The internet's going to do what it does. We're just going to roll with it. No, absolutely.
I'm back.
Nothing.
I don't know where I don't know where I left off, if I even have enough time, but I'll pause there and I'll let Suave or whoever's next go.
Okay, good. All right. So Suave, I just wanted to start with you. After hearing this overview of Black migration, what are your initial thoughts, and how does this, overview or discussion shape or influence your experience with the criminal justice system?
I mean, first, I want to say that hearing the conversation remind me of my mother, because I identify myself as Afro-Latino, period. And I get it from both sides. Like, are you Black? Are you Puerto Rican? What are you? We don't know, Afro-Latino. And I don't think I have to explain why I identify myself as Afro-Latino to anyone, especially my employers. Like, I recently went for a position at community college and I put Afro-Latino. And they called me back and said, what is that? I said, how is y'all running a community college and y'all don't know? And to me, it's almost like, here we go again. We have to explain ourselves. Here we go again. Why are Latinos are being put in this category? Right? We being almost forced to choose when we shouldn't have to, especially in the criminal justice system. I remember coming into the system 30-something years ago, and I put Afro-Latino. Back 34 years ago, in the system, there was only two things you could identify with. It was either Black or white. There was no such thing as Afro-Latino. I had to file a court lawsuit to against the institution to identify as Afro-Latino, and to have the prison population, the Hispanics that was there, to have that choice, because we was being forced to either choose Black or white. And I just thought it was totally wrong. I'm not going for it. You're not going to strip me out of my identity just to satisfy yours. So when I hear this, it's almost like, oh my God, finally we had somebody that broke it down in a way where everybody could understand it. And I just hope that my Latino people, my Puerto Rican people, my Dominican people, my Cuban people understand that when I tell you Black, I don't mean to offend you. I'm just going about what I know, my culture, because I know my history. I know where my grandfathers came from. I know that very much down. My grandfather died at 105 years old. He always told us, my mother come from slavery, my parents come from slavery. So I grew up with that. But I just wonder what my mother would have said if she would have heard this presentation, because she wasn't so eloquently breaking it down to us, but she installed that in us. Like, know your history, know where you come from, and never let nobody strip you of your identity. And right now we're in a crisis in the United States with blacks, white, Hispanics. We in that crisis where I just think that this type of conversation should be in public schools. This type of conversation should be the talk on every social media. Period. Because I'm tired again of just being forced to choose. I'm tired of it. So why not own it? I know what I am. And I could very much say, I'm Puerto Rican. No, I'm Afro Latino. And if you don't know what it is, my employers, my friends, my white friends, then you need to listen to this. And maybe you get it when I tell you where I come from, where I tell you why. Because sometimes they looked at me like Suave is crazy. He reads too many Malcolm X books. He's reading these books again that's playing trick. Even my family, my twin sister, my identical twin sister identify as Caucasian. And to me, it's like, are you crazy? But that's her choice, because she don't know. And if you don't know, I can't blame you for that. But we can't say that the history is not out there, that this information is not out there, because it is. It's just a matter of going out, researching it, and owning it, like somebody wrote in the chat. I own mines. And I would be highly offended if somebody just say, no, you're not Afro-Latino, you just Puerto Rican. I will be offended.
Thank you, Suave. And I want to sort of use your comments to dovetail into a question for Kassandra, because I think we know that the United States incarcerates people in a way that other countries do not, and what that prison population looks like. And so I wanted to know, listening to the overview, how does that influence your perspective on the criminal justice system and the impact and influence it's had on the war on drugs?
Yeah, I really appreciate being invited to come speak at this convening, and really appreciate Janvieve's overview and Suave's comments. I think being a part of this conversation is really interesting and important because I think the criminal justice system, just like white supremacy in general, flattens identity. And it benefits from the flattening of identity. I think there is this, the conversation that we are consistently having, especially in the criminal justice space, is how the machine of incarceration flattens our communities, whether it's through stripping it of resources, whether it's through the way that we learn to talk about each other, but it's also the way that we learn to identify each other. It is by design that a darker skin is more associated with criminality, which goes back to Janvieve's point about how policy is bereft of supporting Black people. I think it's important in my work as in the criminal justice space, in talking about Latinx identity, where does it fit into the conversation around criminal justice? One of the things that I think has often been really hard for me to navigate is because I'm from New York with a very strong Afro-Caribbean population. So the Latinos I met were Black, right? Everybody looked like Suave. So the idea about whether someone was Black or not was not really a part of my consciousness. And when the boys were running from the guys in blue, right? You couldn't tell what they were because they all looked the same, right? So there was never this idea that the criminal justice system and the targeting and the incarceration and the throwing people up against the wall was happening to one group and not the other, because we were all within the gradations of brown, right? And Black. And so I think one of the things that I think is important, especially as I think about my work in criminal justice and in drug policy, is, who are the people that use drugs that people have compassion for? Who are the people who use drugs or who sell drugs, right? So thinking about the people that are lighter skin and them selling drugs versus the people who are of darker skin and them selling drugs, and how the sentencing is different, right? And it really doesn't depend on, it depends on what you look like, right? Like, how close are you to Black, right? Like, how dark is your skin? And I think that is part of the conversation, and that is one that we have to be really cognizant of and very clear about. And then I think the other thing is that recognizing that even within the criminal justice space, we flatten our own identities, right? So there's the idea that all Blackness is the same, but it's not, right? There are Black people that speak tons of different languages, right? So Black people that speak Creole, Haitian Creole like me, Black people that speak Dominican Creole, Black people that speak Jamaican Patois, Black people that speak Spanish, and even the Spanish dialects are different, right? The Spanish that I heard in New York City from the Puerto Ricans is not the same Spanish that I met from the folks from Argentina, right? So there's so many different dialects that I think it's critical for us to actually challenge ourselves, because we flatten ourselves by using the descriptors that white people have given us. There should be no doubt that Black people, Indigenous folks, are the people that catch the most help from society. And I think there's also this growing need for people who are white to want to be connected to the identity of those who are darker skinned, right? And then that complicates the conversation and then makes it really difficult for us to have the really necessary conversations that people from the African diaspora really need to understand. And I think it's shaped so much, like, who are the people that we are seeing that are being criminalized, that are being incarcerated? What is the media saying? Who are the voices that are being uplifted? Like, really think about who are the people that we're seeing. And this is not just in Latinidad. Look at it in the African-American community. It is lighter skinned people in the African-American community that tend to be in positions of power. People with a looser curl pattern tend to be in positions of power. So it's really, when we're looking at the polls that people often talk about, the white and Black, it really is like the fair and dark, right? Like, what, like, in that gradation, how the institutions respond to you in that way. And that's happening regardless of where you're from. And it really needs to shape so that we can sharpen the ways that we navigate these tools of structure of white supremacy.
Thank you, Kassandra. I want to pull out something that you said, how we flatten ourselves. And of course, in our prep call yesterday, we were talking about this, right? Like, how we've now taken on descriptors and characteristics that come from, white individuals, hold up white supremacist systems. For Janvieve, how does acknowledging the history of Black migration work to broaden our perspective? Or, I guess the opposite of flatten would be to grow a better understanding of our identities. How does broadening that perspective help us to come up with creative ways to reform the criminal justice system? And then, if you could speak more to, like, what's at stake for the Latinx community in engaging in that work.
Yeah, great question. And one, it makes people that are not Black reflect on that, because I feel like as soon as there's a migration that happens into United States, there's an erasure that happens, right? And there's a forgetfulness that happens that we exist, right? And I've heard it so many times. One is this myth that there is no racism in the countries that people that are not Black migrated from. And that is because their experience around racism was so void of racism, right? So this is an essential piece of experience versus reality. One piece is like, there is no racism in Mexico, Colombia, Panama, Brazil, Guatemala, El Salvador, you name the country, right? There is no racism in those countries. We learned about racism in the United States. Well, this is not true. This is grounded in myth, not in reality. This is grounded in a lived experience that is not true. And that truth is grounded in the fact that you are not Black or Indigenous descent. That's it. Because if you were Black or Indigenous descent, you have experienced racism. Period. That's it. Which means that you have to be reflective on your privilege, be it your race privilege or your class privilege. I don't even know what I'm saying now, because those are cousins. Those are related. They're interconnected. They get along. They're in a relationship, in a strong marriage, and or a common law relationship, whatever it is that you believe in. They are intertwined. And when you migrate, right, or you're descendant of migration, if you haven't experienced that, then you have to question why you haven't experienced that. But please don't believe that it doesn't exist in those countries that you come from, because it's alive and it's thriving in our countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Juan Cartagena. The false notion that slavery doesn't exist is not true, and it still exists, right? And the other piece is, if most people that are not Black in Latin America, when they migrate, then they're reflective that they really haven't had those strong relationships with people that look like me. So when I speak, people that look like me and Suave and Kassandra that are from the Caribbean and from Latin America, then we become questionable because we're professionals. Right? And then it's like, no, we cannot have all this knowledge, because in our countries of origin, we're domestic workers. We pick up the panties and the calzoncillos. Right, Suave? Right.
Listen, if I could say, it's amazing, because I'm not supposed to be talking to you because I'm an ex-felon. I'm not supposed to be knowing my identity because I'm an ex-felon. I'm not supposed to be educated because I'm an ex-felon, and because I'm Black,
Exactly. No, let's start from your Black.
So I tell people to that, who made that rule up?
The baseline is that we're Black. And being Black means that we're domestic workers, we're ex-felons, we sell raspados, we're the chicharrón, we are the pork rinds. That's what it is. So that's the baseline. So when we're anything above that, we are questionable and we are gaslighted, right? So I can tell you anything and we are lying, right? So that's what it is in a professional manner. So we can start working at a nonprofit or at a bank or anywhere, and we say something that's true, but we're lying. Right. So I think that's a reflective piece of it. It's up in here. It's up in here. Period.
So I want to go back to something, and like all this is working out really well. These questions really well crafted. So I like Kassandra. I'm Haitian American from Brooklyn. I grew up with Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. There's of course there's confusion about who looks like what, and I recognize like there's regional differences, right? If you're from certain parts of the United States, the Latinx community does look like what you think it looks like because that's what you saw growing up. And Suave, you talked about your mother and your grandparents helping you with your identity because they were not shy about it. They explained to you like your history, who you are growing up. Same thing with when I was growing up, we were Haitian American, and my godfather, so he let us know that like we're nothing else. Like even me putting on American was offensive to him. But I wanted to ask you, what are the different ways that learning this history that we're talking about, what are different ways that learning this history can help us develop a more inclusive Latina agenda that can lead to meaningful reform in the criminal justice system?
Well, let me tell you something, right? And I know this from experience. My mother, my grandmother was white, real white. And my mother was left in Puerto Rico as a child. And we talking about 1941 and 42 with my aunt because there was Black. And she was left with my Black family in Puerto Rico because of that. And because people used to think that my mother and my aunt were helping my grandmother that was white. And my grandmother was like, no, those are my kids. So my mother and my aunt that were both dark-skinned was left in Puerto Rico till they was like 13, 14, then brought to New York, to the South Bronx. Right? So I could speak on this. And One way that we all can help and benefit from is having these conversations. Sitting your kids down and be as honest as you can with it. There's no time to sugarcoat this, because this could mean your education, this could mean your job, this could mean your housing. Knowing this could save you a whole lot of problems in America. Period. So I tell people, own it. Sit down and have these conversations with your kids. The same way we have conversations about the police with your kids, you need to have these conversations about your identity with your kids from a very early age. I remember times in the South Bronx when my mother used to sit us down and say, "Oh, today is history night. And it's a Friday. Mommy, we want to go out." Yeah, after I talk to you, after you listen to this, right? I remember the very first time that my grandfather traveled from Puerto Rico to New York. My cousin did look real white. You thought she was a white woman. The first thing she said, "Who is that nigga?" And I was like, "Yo, that's my granddad. What the hell are you talking about?" Then she went out, "Oh," like, because she didn't know. And I still remember that. And I still remind her of that day. Like, like, how stupid and how fucking ignorant, excuse my language, can you be, right? To say some shit like that when your mother is Black. But this comes, this play in the part that in our culture, sometimes, we want to play the white role because we think we could get more. And you saw that in the early 70s and 80s coming up in the South Bronx. To be identified as Black was like, whoa, it's almost like being criminalized. Not me, no. In my households, everybody was Black. And we knew that. So there was no different to me from going out and seeing my brothers and sisters in the street. We all brothers. There was no, she's Dominican and I'm Puerto Rican. We were all Black in our building. We were all Black. We all identify as Black. We didn't identify, she's Haitian, she's Dominican, she's Cuban. That was an adult. After we became adults, like, I never knew you was Dominican. I thought you was just like her, because that's what we was taught. So if we want to make a change, we need to have these conversations with our kids. We need to have these conversations. We need to play this conversation back and use it as a footnote. Like, listen to this. Because, a lot of people don't get this history. Unless you researching it and studying it, they just don't know. Oh, I don't have time to study that. Okay, cool. So when you go to your next job and they start discriminating against you and you find yourself in that position that, who I'm going to don't call me. Because I've been telling you. I just went through that when I went for a job. The man asked me, what do Afro-Latino means? And I'm just looking at him like, and you got a PhD in what?
So Kassandra, you shared some similar experiences to Suave's, just sort of growing up and, this is who you saw, this is who you engaged with. I wanted to hear from you, if you could speak to how your experiences and understanding of this history and Black migration, as we are talking about it, how has that shaped your ability to develop a multiracial analysis of the criminal justice system, especially with your work with the Drug Policy Alliance and the results of the war on drugs?
I think, again, coming up in the New York space, I have the privilege of our criminal justice system actually doing a better job than most places in the US that actually categorizes Black and Latinos people's stats around criminal justice. So in New York, I'm able to point to, like, this is how many white people, this is how many Asian people, this is how many Black people, this is how many Latino people. So it creates more space where people are able to see themselves because the data is clearer in New York around the criminal justice issues that we're navigating and fighting against. We're also seeing that in our harm reduction services, Puerto Ricans are one of the biggest service consumers of our harm reduction structures in New York City, right? And so very large Puerto Rican population in the South Bronx are using syringe exchanges. And so there's a lot of work and a lot of peers that are going out there and having different conversations. We're still navigating really hard, like cultural education stuff that we need to do. But because of the way that because of who fought for it, right? Like the HIV/AIDS crisis, yes, it was a lot of leadership of white gay men in New York, but the Black and Puerto Ricans were tearing shit up in the 90s and holding stuff down, right? You know, in New York, people don't realize that our POC elected official caucus is called the Black Puerto Rican Hispanic Asian Caucus, right? Like that. I think because of the very real historical contributions and fighting of Puerto Ricans in New York City, it doesn't erase the difficulties and the erasure that is happening in the criminal justice space of Latinx folks, but because of the really strong leadership, you know, the New York City policing community was led by Richie Perez, right? So like, and, you know, who sat down with the MXGM folks, like really building out an infrastructure that was multiracial, right? And really talked about different identities. I say it quite often that the first police killing that I know about is Anthony Bias, right? So like even in the way that I was acculturated and understanding that the police don't like me, I didn't learn that because a Haitian person was killed. I learned that because a Puerto Rican was killed. And because I saw Puerto Ricans like me, right? Like the Puerto Ricans and me are the same. Like, because that's how I was brought up and because I come from a Caribbean background. But honestly, I think one of the biggest things that is really difficult in navigating the criminal justice space is the lack of diversity amongst Latino organizations, right? I'm rarely in rooms with the heads of Latino organizations that look like Janvieve or Suave, right? Like it is mostly white Latinos that are at the head of these organizations, right? And so when we're having these conversations, and it's not that they don't have opinions or experiences or don't have family members that are Black or more indigenous presenting, it's just that in the space, it's very rare that you will find Black Latinos in positions of power or leading campaigns around criminal justice. And that is a conversation that we need to have. I do not identify as a Latino person, but I do identify as a Black person from Latin America because I'm from Haiti, right? And so, but I don't share the cultural kind of, like I don't speak the same language. So I can't code switch like that, right? So it's like, it's really important for us to like really be thinking, because I think if there are no Black people who speak Spanish in a room full of Black people creating an agenda, then the Black conversation is not comprehensive, right? If Suave is not in a room when we are building the agenda for Black liberation when it comes to criminal justice, that is not a complete room. Sorry, go ahead, Suave.
You know what? I was at a convention with the Ford Foundation about a year and a half ago. They were talking about criminal justice reform. I mean, all these millionaires in the room. When the question was asked, how many of y'all been in the prison system, or how many of y'all even visited prison? Guess how many hands went up? Guess how many hands? Guess who was the only formerly incarcerated person there? I mean, I felt like I was like, whoa, what the heck going on here? How can y'all be having these conversations and nobody here has ever been inside a prison?
That's right. And it doesn't make any sense. Especially if you're looking at the federal system, the amount of Latinos that are there, if you're looking at who's being held on bail, more than likely is Latinos. If we're looking at all these different metrics, but the problem is that the data is not set up. Either Latinos are being categorized as white or Black, right? And even when people even think about indigenous folks, and there is a conversation about the indigenous folks to the soil of the Turtle Island and those that have migrated here. But even there's a massive underreporting of indigenous folks and their incarceration in the United States. So
I'll tell you this, in Pennsylvania, when you get incarcerated, they ask you, what are you? And a lot of 90% of the time, people identify as white. And I'll tell you why, because they be put in a cell where they could be the dominated force, right? They be put in positions where somebody's not going to mess with me because I live with a white guy in a cell, right? And these are real things that happen in the prison system. So when you go and do your research, it's almost like there's no Latinos in the prison, but you seeing the faces. You seeing the faces, but when you're looking back at their ID cards, where they put race, you see white.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we are adamant about at Afroresistance, for example, is the gender component, right? And I spoke about that, and I think I was cut off, right? But one of the things, for example, that we are clear about, and I do not know this. Oh, don't tell me okay. I'm like, don't tell me it froze again. But and I'm sure it mirrors what happened. And I live in the Bronx, right? And I'm sure it mirrors because we work with Black Latino families in the Bronx that have been impacted by incarceration that are migrants, right? And a lot of them undocumented. But in countries like Colombia specifically, right, we know that 68% of women that are incarcerated are Black women, right? And that 50% are between 18 and 29-year-olds. And most of them are heads of households. And we work with families that have children. And those children, right, are also directly impacted, obviously, by the system. So by my children, right, go to a public school in Washington Heights. And we specifically pick that school because it's a dual language school, and they focus on families that have been impacted by incarceration. And my family has been impacted by incarceration. That school specifically, the amount of children with IEPs, and we're not talking about children, right? And Washington Heights is mostly Latino and Black, right? So what's happening in New York City with children that are impacted by incarceration? Because we're carrying the brunt of that. And this is civil, and this is like, and so this is the work that is being carried out as well, right? That we're also not addressing, that is racialized. That is racialized and Latino and Black. So these are the conversations that are gender specific within Black Latinidad and Caribbean. I'm not going to let out Caribbean too, because it's very Caribbean too. The school is very Caribbean, and this is a public school system. So this is, and it's very gendered. Sorry, Jennifer.
No problem. I wanted to make a note that if there are questions from the audience, if you could put them in the comments so we can try to get them answered. Because while I have moderator questions, I want to make sure that folks that are watching are able to get their questions asked. And I want to ask this question because I think it adds to the complexity of this conversation, and sort of kind of going off of what Kassandra was saying a little bit, but the other side of it, and the question from the audience is, sometimes I hear Latinx with light skin complain that they're discriminated against by darker skinned members of their community. How can I, the person who presented this question, respectfully respond to that assertion? I don't know who wants to go first on that. Suave, you're unmuted, so I guess you can go first.
I mean, I don't know if my response is. I'd rather not just say what I really want to say or what I tell people. But I always tell my people that tell me that, walk a minute in my shoes and welcome to America. Welcome to America. You complaining because a darker person says something to you. How you think I feel when I walk into a public assistant office seeking help, and because of my color, sometimes I don't even get a response. You got to come back tomorrow, or We don't provide that kind of service here after I waited 4 or 5 hours. But I'm watching everybody else that look other than me receive the service. So welcome to America. This is America. We all gonna get discriminated on at some point in life. And it just happened to be your light skin cell, they got discriminated today. So sorry, but this is America. And I want to keep it clean, right?
I appreciate you doing that, keeping it clean.
Yeah, I want to keep it clean. But this is, this goes back to what we said earlier: education, education, and education. Educate yourself. So when you educate yourself, you won't feel that offended when somebody is discriminated against you because you light skinned.
Janvieve, did you also want to weigh in on that?
Just real short, because I feel like there could be other, like, more time allocated to other questions, but this is unfortunately being stuck in the crossfires of colorism, and that's it for me.
There is another question from the audience, and I think this is also just sort of important to have. This was kind of alluded to earlier. Family dynamics are very real. What are tips and ways to have more effective conversations about race, anti-Blackness, and historical or current oppression with family members and loved ones? And then Kassandra, I'm going to have you answer this question first. And I say this because even in a Black country like Haiti, like, white supremacy, as invasive as it is, still pervades. And if you enjoy Haitian music like compa, all of the famous people, like, they look Egyptian in a country that is specifically Black. Don't get me wrong, like, I love Harmonique too, but I'm just saying, like, so for Kassandra, if you want to go ahead and take a first crack at that question.
I've actually been really impressed by some of the work that's been happening in Dominican Republic around colorism and hair. And I know it sounds really like rudimentary and elementary, but I think I have been seeing a lot of folks, and you're seeing a lot of people on the island embrace, everyday engagements like their hair, and talking and breaking down palo malo and like cheve babo and like all that stuff. So I think in my family, where we have different hues of people that are like super fair to like super dark, I think one of the biggest things that we don't see is like the nicknames. Because those are the kinds of like insidious ways that you reinforce stuff. So in my generation of folks, people have really chilled on the nicknames that are based on colorism or different kinds of like phenotypical situations. And then also really doing extra work to find diversity of color gradation. And like, what are we centering in the conversations? What are we actually talking about? Even from the music, Jennifer, to what you're talking about, to also just like the kinds of Haitian people that we elevate in conversation. Because I think part of the reason why there's a lot of Egyptians in compa music is because there's been a large Arab migration in Haiti, right? And people that are not Black get to move to the top of the list, and they have the most resources. And again, this is based on colorism. And so I think there's I think for us in our family, we've really checked on nicknames and just everyday interactions about like who's getting what and how we're talking to folks.
Great, thank you. I wanted to just ask one more question as we've been kind of talking through, and I want to change it a little bit. Just the way that it's written, because I think all of you have done a really good job in just setting the scene and the understanding. Like, we recognize that there are challenges before us, but I think, and I'm framing this to ensure that people don't misinterpret a lot of the comments that have been made today as oppression Olympics. That's not what people are here to. There's no gold medal in the oppression Olympics. This is not to say that I have it harder, you have it harder. It's just that there is a unifying theme, which is like there is a combative, pervasive energy that spans Americas that we need to discuss, and that's white supremacy. And so what are your recommendations to raise awareness about the influence that white supremacy continues to hold in shaping the criminal justice system? And I mean, this is a big question now. And what do we need to do in order to strip the hold of white supremacy amongst the Latinx community? Janvieve, if you'd like to go first.
Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
Yeah, it was a big question. It was a big question. What are your recommendations to raise awareness about the influence that white supremacy continues to hold in the criminal justice system? And then what do we need to do to strip that hold among the Latinx community?
Yeah. The first thing is one, question policies, right? So question the root of it. The police state is one of them, right? So questioning the police state, why it was created, number one, and that will get you all back to slavery, right? And surveillance, because it's intertwined, right? Of course, right? And policy, right? I always go back to policy. Policy is meant to surveil and to monitor and to control, right? I don't think people question the root of policy and how they don't usually make sense. Like the math doesn't add up, right? And who is behind, right? So when policy is made, like, why is it made? How? And what's the money behind it, right? The fines, like all that. Like I'm always like, oye, otra vaina más, like something else is coming up, and the fines and the this and that, even like the damn Easy Pass, right? Like even like those minutia, to me is always like, it's always something else, like constantly, and it's all punitive. And in that punitive, Black people are always at a disadvantage. Migrants are always at a disadvantage, right? It's constant. Like every single time that you have to fill out a form, it's always a fine. Why? And who is behind it? Who are the politicians behind it? To me, it's always a question. Don't be passive about it. Question. Educate yourself and find out. Go knocking on those doors that are always closed and find out why the hell they're closed. Right? That's number one. And they're always in your neighborhood. And even if you're undocumented, you have the right to find out why they're closed and make sure that they're open. That's number one. And then the other piece around, like within the Latino community, like, don't give me this thing around like you want to be anti-Black. If you really wanted to be anti-Black, you would have been anti-Black already. The information is out there. When people tell me this, like, oh, how can I be better? My community, my family, my abuelita, like the information has been out there already. You already, or, you know, I know people at bookstores, right? Like the Lit Bar in the Bronx, they say that people order all the books that come out about anti-racism and people don't pick them up. And that includes white Latinos. So pick up your books and read them. Don't say that you have the books. People have the bookcases full of books. Read them. The articles are there. You already read the articles, watch the documentaries. Like, how many times can you fail kindergarten? Right? Before you apply the knowledge. So apply the knowledge. Don't call Kassandra to work through your anti-Blackness. Don't do that. Don't call Suave again. Don't call me again. Don't call Jennifer again to work through the issues that you had with somebody in grade 4. Like, don't do it. Just apply the knowledge and be anti-Black. You already know what to do. I think that's the key. Apply the knowledge. Don't get stuck. Apply it. It's not that hard. If you want to be anti-racist and be anti-Black, be it. Don't think about it. Don't rationalize it. Don't be like, oh, we can do better. Do better. Organizations that are watching us, hire the Black people. Make it an environment where you actually, and don't abuse them. Right? Like, just do it. I probably don't want to work there, but just do it. Like, don't make it hostile for that, for people that look like Suave and us. Like, just do it and just do it. Like, I think that's it. Like just just don't be in your head so much. Just apply it.
Well, we unfortunately are coming up on time, but I wanted to thank all of our panelists, Janvieve Williams-Comrie, Kassandra, Frederique, and Suave Gonzalez, for being here with us. Of course, we were not going to solve the problems that is caused by white supremacy and capitalism in an hour. If we could do that, then we could probably do a lot. But I do want to thank you all for sharing your comments and your stories. I think people really don't remember that stories, personal stories and experiences, are also essential to learning and teaching. And so thank you all for doing that and just providing us with more insight about the collective work that we need to do to ensure that, with lived experiences at the center of our work, how deeply rooted racism is in Latin America, and how it serves to erase and otherize Afro-Latinos and individuals of Black descent. I wanted to leave you all with some takeaways. Again, just recognizing that this is just the beginning of the conversation. This is much larger than we have the ability to kind of conquer today. But a few things that came up in this conversation, and probably will throughout the conference, is just this need for specific and unique and differentiated information and language. There's, again, just conversations about what do we call this community? Latinx, Latino, Latina. Is there some, Afro-Latinos, Indigenous? There's all these sort of terms, and so it's important for us to be specific and start to name what we are in this community. It's important to keep this community as comprehensive and inclusive as possible. Again, just focusing on the comments made by Janvieve and Kassandra about organizations, make sure that they are reflective in their, not only in their foot soldiers, but in their leadership when we're talking about the Latinx community. And then also recognize that the lens of whiteness and white bias does influence and inform the way that we view ourselves and each other. So it's important to be aware of that. And as Janvieve said, apply the knowledge. The books are out there for sure. I have some if you want to borrow. But again, apply the knowledge, because this is just the start of a conversation. And so it should be a conversation that we're always having. So again, okay. So with that said, again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you again to our panelists for their comments. And I hope the rest of you all will continue following along with the conference. Okay. Oh, yeah. And start moving into the sessions.